everyone. Welcome to our second episode of this series. Jim, it's good to see you again. Did you get away over Easter? I know you love caravans.
I loathe caravans. We should explain to our listeners from outside Northern Ireland that from Easter onwards, evangelical Christians in this part of the world enact a strange ritual. They rise like a flock of birds from their comfortable homes in Lisburn and Belfast and fly northwards to spend their weekends in large caravans. So they abandon their homes and churches for the pleasure of sitting in a large tin box, listening to the rain drum on its roof. I mean, I honestly think it's a form of madness. Almost, but not quite as mad as camping. People who go camping, in my judgment, are in serious need of medical help.
I'm actually inclined to agree with you, Jim, on the camping point. However, I'm currently working against my better instincts and arranging a camping trip for my brother's stag do. And it does feel like I'm arranging a form of self-flagellation.
Yeah, I quite agree. I mean, I've never understood why people give themselves unnecessary hassle. Back in the 1970s, when everybody had avocado bathrooms and dimmer switches, Christians here became obsessed with a thing called a fondue set. Have you heard of this?
I love a fondue, Jim.
Well, I will never forget my first experience of fondue dining. Each person around the table was given a long fork, and you're expected to spear a piece of raw meat with this fork and then place the meat in a metal container full of boiling oil. Now, I was raised in a home that regarded rare meat as a work of Satan, so we all sat patiently for 5 minutes, maybe longer, before placing a small block of tasteless lava in our mouths. And this madness was called a fun experience. I mean, people who think that the world has gone from bad to worse have clearly forgotten just how awful life was in the 1970s.
I think we should have a regular segment on our podcast, Jim, around the life of an evangelical in the 1970s. I mean, many of our listeners will have no real insight into that period. But you do realize that 70s style and design has made a bit of a comeback. So my brother has just purchased a green corduroy sofa, and in the coming weeks is planning to purchase a yellow fridge. And I strongly believe these are decisions he'll regret in the years to come.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't even mentioned the real horror of Sunday nights in the 70s. After supper, the hostess would smile brightly and say, "Now, let's watch a slideshow from our last holiday." And we have 3 full magazines to get through. I mean, the expression of my dad's face made me think he was about to jump into the vat of boiling oil on the table. No, let's just forget the 70s, Ollie. In the words of Boris Johnson, we shall allow the blessed sponge of amnesia to wipe the slate of memory clean. Otherwise, I'll end up on a psychiatrist's couch.
Okay, then I think it's time for our regular gear change to more serious matters, Jim. In this season of the podcast, we're considering controversies that have kicked up storms on Twitter. And in this episode, we must think perhaps of the most serious storm of them all, the arguments over abuse and authority in the church. And these conversations will raise difficult and sensitive topics, so we'll have to travel carefully through the issues. The strange thing about this controversy is that it brings together 2 issues that at first sight seem to have nothing to do with each other. The first issue is the question of sexual abuse in evangelical churches, and the second issue is the role of women in evangelical churches.
It's important that we say up front, Ollie, that this episode is not primarily focused on the terribly difficult question of sexual abuse. I'm not sure either of us has the pastoral insight to talk about such a sensitive topic. So we're only raising it now because on social media, the question of sexual abuse in evangelical churches has been linked to the controversy over the role of women in those churches.
So we're going to structure the conversation in the following way. First, we'll survey the conversations going on Twitter about sexual abuse in evangelical churches, particularly in the US. Then we'll look at arguments going on about the role of women in those same churches. And then thirdly, we'll examine how Twitter brings those 2 issues together.
That's good. And once we've done those 3 things, I'd like to have a discussion about how to debate the role of women in church. I mean, as most of our listeners know, there are 2 basic positions taken by evangelicals on this topic. There's what's called the egalitarian view, which states that there should be no gender distinctions made in church. And then there is the complementarian view, which states that men and women have different roles in family life and in church life. Now, I happen to be a complementarian. But before all our egalitarian listeners switch off this episode, let me quickly say that I'm not going to try and persuade anyone to change their minds on this issue. I mean, Christians have argued over it for decades, and that's perfectly fine. The point of this entire episode is to highlight that there is a right way and a wrong way to debate the role of women in the church. And the wrong way will almost certainly lead to tens of thousands of churches splitting and dying over the next few years. So this is serious stuff. So our aim is not to turn egalitarians into complementarians. Okay, our aim is to help everyone debate the question in a healthy and biblical way.
Right, let's begin by addressing the very sensitive issue of sexual abuse in evangelical churches. In 2017, the term Church2 went viral on social media. It builds on the hashtag #MeToo movement that rose up against sexual abuse, sexual harassment, and rape culture. Survivors of sexual assault in church settings and their advocates had been calling on churches for years to admit the extent of abuse in their midst and to implement reforms. But the controversy exploded within the Southern Baptist Convention in 2022. Southern Baptists are the largest Protestant denomination in the US, and a year earlier, the convention had authorized an independent investigation team from Guidepost Solutions to produce a report on sexual abuse in SBC churches. The report turned out to be a bombshell. It claimed that for decades, senior figures in the movement had deliberately ignored and covered up allegations of abuse. Predatory pastors still served in some pulpits, it was claimed. The arguments within the SBC became very bitter and public. One of their best-known figures, the theologian Russell Moore, resigned from the SBC in protest at how the convention had handled the issue. He's now the editor of Christianity Today. In 2022, Moore said this about the Guidepost report. "I was wrong to call sexual abuse in the Southern Baptist Convention a crisis. Crisis is too small a word. It is an apocalypse."
Russell Moore was just one of the many voices that railed against the SBC, and it might be helpful to mention a few other players involved. David French described Southern Baptists as a diseased orchard. Perhaps the most significant figure is a young lawyer called Rachel Denhollander. She is well known as the author of a book called What is a Girl Worth? As a girl, Denhollander had been a talented gymnast, and she had been sexually abused by her coach, a monstrous man called Larry Nassar. Nassar was sentenced to 60 years in prison for abuse of hundreds of children and young women. Rachel Denhollander was the first woman to break the silence over Nassar's wickedness. As you said a minute ago, Ollie, the focus of this episode is not on sexual abuse. But let me point people to a talk given by Rachel Denhollander on that subject. You can find it on YouTube. It lasts for about 50 minutes and it's called The Lion and the Lamb, How the Gospel Informs Our Response to Abuse. I think every Christian pastor, every church elder should watch that video. Now, when we get into the later conversation, I might make some mild criticisms of Denhollander's approach, but I want to state up front that she is a courageous, intelligent, and gracious Christian woman. Perhaps the most important thing Christian leaders should do in this area of life, especially male leaders, is listen. If ever the Apostle James' instruction needs to be heard, it is in the arena of sexual abuse. Men should be quick to listen and slow to speak. Denhollander's voice is the voice of a survivor of abuse, and she deserves to be heard. Now, in the context of the SBC controversy, Rachel Denhollander played a central role as an activist and an advocate for abuse survivors. She used her skills as a lawyer to persuade the SBC to employ that company you mentioned, Guidepost Solutions, as an independent investigator, and she has been engaged ever since in the battle over the report that they produced.
The media piled the pressure on the Southern Baptists, with most of the broadsheets in the US carrying articles about a crisis over abuse that some claimed was as big as the crisis that had hit the Catholic Church years earlier. But it would be unfair of us not to mention that there are voices raised on the other side of the argument.
That's quite right. Once the media storm subsided and people started to pick over the report, some concerning questions came to light. Guidepost had found 409 cases of abuse over a 21-year period, but all of them were already in the public domain. It was pointed out that the SBC covers 47,000 churches with up to 150,000 staffers, workers and pastors. So in cold statistical terms, the 409 figure is much lower than the equivalent figure in wider society. Statisticians calculated that the SBC figure, if it was reflected in broader society, should have been in the thousands. And it was also pointed out that only 2 of those cases were current. Now, 409 instances of vile wickedness is 409 too many. There should be no acceptable level of abuse within a Christian denomination. So I'm not making a defence here. Listeners can interpret the facts for themselves, but what I'm going to do is lay out the facts of Guidepost's star case study. Okay, it concerns a woman called Jennifer Lyle. She began a relationship with a married professor called David Sills when she was in her early 20s and he was in his late 40s. The relationship lasted for 12 years. Quite a long time afterwards, Jennifer Lyle claimed that she had been the victim of abuse. She accused David Sills of violence and coercion. Jennifer Lyle's lawyer was Rachel Denhollander, and Denhollander argued that David Sills was a violent sexual abuser. She managed to get her client to tell her story to Albert Mohler. Many listeners will know him as a very senior figure in the SBC, and Mohler believed her, and so he fired David Sills from his position in an SBC seminary. But as we saw earlier, there were contradictory voices raised against Denhollander's case. David Sills admitted the relationship, but he claimed that it was consensual, and that claim was backed up by some of his friends. Curiously, Lyle had apparently come close to David Sills' wife and family and had visited them after she had moved to a different state. Now, the dramatic moment in the story occurs when the report on the Lyle affair came before the SBC Executive Committee. They took a decision to reword some of the language. Instead of using the term abuse, they changed it and used the phrase inappropriate moral behaviour. Rachel Denhollander called out the SBC executive on this point, claiming that the rewording was yet another example of men covering up the predatory behaviour of other men. It was described by one journalist as an egregious and rampant dismissal of sexual abuse. Now, it's really important to say that, Ollie, we're not taking sides in this story, okay? It's really none of our business. But the controversy raises some frightening issues for church leaders on this side of the Atlantic.
Most disputes in church are handled using principles laid down in Matthew chapter 18. And in that chapter, the Lord Jesus sets out a 3-stage process that involves witnesses and evaluation of evidence. But as our civil courts have discovered, those principles become really challenging in the case of sexual abuse allegations. We need to recognize that it takes enormous courage for a woman to allege sexual abuse.
Yeah, I completely understand why people like Rachel Denhollander insist that what she calls specialist, trauma-informed soul care providers, people like that, to take the lead in any investigation into sexual abuse. But in the context of a local church, I am deeply uncomfortable with the idea that a group of elders can simply outsource the problem to a specialist advocate group. We have to remember that the firm used by the SBC, Guidepost Solutions, wasn't even a Christian firm. So we're all going to have to think about this more deeply. But at the moment anyway, 3 principles have emerged in my own mind. First, any allegation of sexual abuse must be investigated with the help of wise and gentle women who have the trust of the elders. Second, church authorities should never do what civil authorities are there to do. If a man is accused of doing something that could end in a custodial sentence, then that matter should be handed over to civil authorities without delay. As a minimum, the victim should be advised to go down that route, no matter how embarrassing it might be for the church if the story gets into the press. John Piper tweeted recently that it's better to accept an injustice than take another unbeliever to court. Now, he was thinking of a dispute over money, and in that context he may be right. But in our context, in the context of abuse, it's more damaging to the cause of Christ not to involve civil authorities than it is to use them. So when it comes to sexual abuse, the church should be utterly transparent. The third principle is that plurality of leadership and good governance are great safety mechanisms. I mean, think of that ghastly case of Ravi Zacharias. That case makes this principle obvious. Zacharias had been shown to have been an abuser of power and money, a sexual predator who has brought terrible disgrace upon the Christian church. And the question everyone asks is, how did he get away with it? Well, it's clear now that RZIM had no governance procedures in place. So Zacharias could do what he wanted. He was accountable to no one. Church governance should be designed to expose any form of sin in church life. I remember years ago when we were designing the financial processes of our own church, I shocked everyone in the room by saying that we needed to assume that any of the finance roles could be held by an embezzler. So we had to design processes that would flush such a person out. It really offended the church treasurer until he understood my point. So in our processes now, the person who cuts the checks is not allowed to keep the books. The bookkeeper is not allowed to process the gift aid. There have to be at least 2 money counters each Sunday. We are audited by independent professionals. So that's just an example. But I think churches should think about all their processes in that light. What if the pastor or a youth leader is an abuser? Just as a theoretical exercise, think through how your processes might flush someone like that out.
So we've thought about the first of our 2 controversies, the problem of sexual abuse in evangelical churches. The second controversy is about the role of women in evangelical churches. In recent weeks, Rick Warren's Saddleback Church has been thrown out of the SBC because it has appointed women pastors. And Beth Moore, perhaps the most famous female Bible teacher in the world, has publicly apologized for her earlier commitment to complementarity. Beth Moore's change of heart on this issue is seen by many as a pivotal moment for evangelicalism. Beth Allison Barr, a Baylor University historian and author, likened Moore to the biblical Joshua, commanding the people to shout so the walls of Jericho fall down. She just shouted, said Barr of Moore. This is going to be the beginning of the end of complementarianism.
It might be helpful to set this moment in its historical context. The 1960s and 70s saw the rise of Christian feminism. The sexual revolution had caused wider society to reject what you might call the 1950s view of women as homemakers and supportive spouses. Women were breaking free from the patriarchal constraints of history. And that movement placed real pressure on traditional Christian doctrines about the role of men and women in family life and in the church. So a reactionary movement within evangelicalism began, and it led to the establishment of a thing called the Council for Biblical Manhood and Womanhood, CBMW for short. And in November 1988, the CBMW published what it called the Danvers Statement. It consisted of 10 affirmations that defined the thing that we now call complementarianism. The Southern Baptists swung in behind the Danvers Statement, and for a long time complementarians held sway in SBC seminaries. At the same time, the rise of Reformed theology brought formidable intellectual firepower in support of complementarity. So that's why today, for example, the Gospel Coalition is so strongly complementarian.
Most people connect with that history through a book called Recovering Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. It was edited by John Piper and Wayne Grudem. In many ways, the Piper and Grudem book represents the high watermark of the complementarity doctrine. In more recent times, egalitarian academics have launched strong counter-arguments. So the feminist historian I mentioned earlier, Beth Allison Barr, has published a book called The Making of Biblical Womanhood, in which he argues that what complementarians call biblical womanhood is in fact a form of pagan patriarchy. Another egalitarian author is Amy Bird, who wrote a book called Recovering from Biblical Manhood and Womanhood. Her big argument is that complementarity excludes women from the intellectual life of the church. Now, all these historical arguments might just be the normal toing and froing that occurs in theological debates, but something new is happening. And you think it's quite sinister, don't you, Jim?
I do. Without wishing to be dramatic, something is going on just now within evangelicalism that has caused me a few sleepless nights. The 2 controversies we've been talking about have been conflated. They've been brought together. So the problem of sexual abuse and the arguments over complementarity are now being described as 2 sides of the same coin.
A conservative Christian journalist called Megan Bashan wrote an article on the SBC controversy we mentioned at the start. She says this: "The subject of abuse has become a political football that various factions have been leveraging to settle bitter scores and sway the direction of the denomination on issues that have nothing to do with abuse, like allowing women into the pastorate."
To put this in blunt terms, complementarity is being blamed for abuse in the church. There's a popular online magazine called Vox, and its article on the SBC debacle said this: "Complementarianism creates a power structure where a man who is accused of terrible things by those this theology views as beneath him is given often endless benefit of the doubt." There's another progressive Christian author who says, "The underlying systemic issues have to do with a theology that said some people are favoured by God, some people have more power, and God supports them having that power and exerting it over others. That creates an environment that says God supports power over saying God is about love and inclusion."
How can the doctrine of complementarianism be blamed for the abuse of women in church?
Well, to answer that, I want to talk about a recently published book, and then we'll take a real-world case study to show how the argument works in practice. So the book I want to talk about is called Redeeming Power, Understanding Authority and Abuse in the Church, and it's written by a woman called Diane Langberg. She is very well known in Christian circles because she was an advocate for abuse survivors in the Ravi Zacharias story. Langberg is an academic. She's a psychologist who specialises in the treatment of trauma. Now, Ollie, one of our favourite hobby horses in this podcast is to highlight how neo-Marxist ideologies have infected Western civilization. And I'm very fond of saying that the progressive left pushes two main ideologies. The first is a thing called expressive individualism, and that's the ideology behind sexualized identities. But the second bogeyman is a thing called critical theory. And according to critical theory, every society is binary. There's always an oppressor, and then there are oppressed groups. So in our own society, white heterosexual men oppress marginalized groups like women, people of colour, and the LGBT community. So that's the big idea behind critical theory. Everything boils down to a power struggle between an oppressor and the oppressed. And it seems to me that Diane Langberg's book brings critical theory, hooves, horns and tail, into the Christian church. She views every aspect of church life through the lens of power. Everything that is wrong, she thinks, can be explained by the abuse of power. So just as critical race theorists see systemic racism in every institution of society, so Langberg sees Christianity as a set of intrinsically abusive systems. These systems are designed to protect abusers from being uncovered.
In the first chapter of the book, she speaks to Christians and says, "We sanction millions of dollars being used fraudulently for God, with no concern for those we are lying to. We tolerate bullying at the helm of Christian organizations because that's just the way it is. We protect a gifted youth leader because the numbers are growing, even though several have come forward and spoken haltingly about abuse. We tell boys and girls that the pastor or coach or leader in the church family could not possibly have meant anything sexual."
That paragraph had such a bad effect on my blood pressure because at the end of every sentence I shouted out, "No, I don't."
Langberg identifies a large range of different types of abuse. There is sexual abuse, physical abuse, of course, but she introduces forms of power such as verbal power, economic power, emotional power, power that comes from knowledge and skill. She then explains how vulnerable groups can be abused by verbally powerful, the emotionally powerful, and so on. The book also contains a lot of material on what Langberg calls spiritual abuse. So the term abuse, as Langberg uses it, has been widened enormously.
I think she makes the concept of abuse so wide that it cannot serve any useful analytical purpose. This is her key move. And I have to admit that it makes me quite angry. I mean, I came across an example of alleged abuse in a US church. A young woman had felt disrespected by her pastor. He had dismissed one of her theories as doctrinally incorrect. Now, it would appear that the pastor had been a little ungracious, definitely grumpy, but the young woman described her experience as abuse. She left the church and called herself a survivor of abuse. Now, that's actually quite a wicked thing to do. She's placing herself in the same category as poor women and children who have been raped or abused by men in authority, and in so doing, the very concept of abuse is being trivialized. And Langberg, she makes this move all the time. At one point, she talks about the horrors of the Holocaust. Without doubt, humanity's darkest moment. 6 million Jewish men, women and children systematically exterminated by being gassed in the ovens of Auschwitz. Now, says Langberg, the Nazis did this for the sake of racial purity. Yet is that not what we do when we cast truth-telling victims from our midst and label them disruptive? We throw them in the ovens of shame. Now, I wish that was a one-off comment. But she makes the same move when discussing the genocide in Rwanda. You'll recall that during the Rwandan genocide, millions of innocent people were butchered. But Langberg draws a straight line from that genocide to poor behaviour in church. The result in Rwanda, she says, was a visible, heart-wrenching picture of what happens when shepherds meant to shelter and feed the flock instead become predatory themselves or are complicit with predators. So, those two examples show you what happens when you apply critical theory to church life. Once you insist that everything has to be explained in terms of the abuse of power, then the term abuse loses all its meaning. The concept is now so wide that it is meaningless.
So I hear your point, Jim, about how Langberg widens the scope of the term abuse. But could you tell us more about why the doctrine of complementarity gets blamed for sexual abuse?
Okay, well, let's just apply critical theory to a local church. Who is the oppressor? The pastor or a group of elders. Men, in other words. And who is the oppressed? Women. And how does the oppressor maintain his hold on power? By excluding women from all leadership positions, by silencing them in formal worship gatherings, or by refusing to allow them to teach the Bible. It is the doctrine of complementarity, according to critical theory, that is to blame for maintaining the oppressive structures in a church. And it is those structures which allow male sexual predators to operate without fear of being caught. But those structures also allow men to perform all other kinds of abuse, whether it be emotional, verbal, or spiritual.
So your point is then that Lamberg portrays the Christian church as a collection of systems that allow men to abuse power. And the key instrument of repression is actually the doctrine of complementarity. So according to critical theory, the noble action is to rebel against the oppressive structures. So egalitarianism is now portrayed as the fight for social justice in the church. There's a controversy going on at the moment which illustrates the point you're making, and it relates to John MacArthur's church in California, Grace Community Church. We need to start with some historical background. So about 20 years ago, a couple called David and Eileen Gray asked for counseling at MacArthur's church. Their marriage had run into such trouble that Eileen had obtained a restraining order to protect the couple's 3 children from what was called the excessive discipline exercised by David Gray. The counselors at the church confronted David, and he confessed his sin and appeared to repent. But when his wife was unconvinced and refused to return to the family home, MacArthur's church then excommunicated Eileen for refusing to return to her husband. A year later, the 3 children revealed that their father had been sexually abusing them. David Gray was convicted of child abuse and is now in prison. But Grace Community Church has never publicly apologized for their earlier decision to discipline Eileen.
Just to finish that story off, we need to say that, in all fairness, the police did an investigation into the church's involvement in the marriage and the elders were exonerated. But it does look, albeit from this great distance, as if they were terribly naive in their assessment of the situation. Anyway, that's the background. Now let's turn to the current controversy. A so-called internet journalist called Julie Royce has been gunning for John MacArthur over this old story. And her strategy has been to say that MacArthur's complementarity is to blame for the way the case was handled. A child molester was protected and an innocent woman shamed, she says, because of patriarchal arrogance. Royce has written over 50 articles in this story, and she stated that her aim is to shut MacArthur down, to cancel him in Twitter language. And to meet that aim, Royce has spun a narrative that blames the patriarchal doctrines of MacArthur for how his church mishandled the case. Now, the strange anomaly in this saga is that Royce herself has admitted that earlier on in her life, she could have been accused of an abuse of power. She was married at the time, in her mid-30s, working as a youth pastor in a church, and she admits to an obsession with helping a dysfunctional teenage girl who identified as a lesbian. Royce confesses that the intense relationship made her confused and distraught. She didn't want to give up on the relationship. She knew it was unhealthy and dangerous, even though deep down she knew something was seriously wrong. And she knew that there was an abuse of power in the relationship. Now, my point here is not simply that Royce is a hypocrite. It's that it never enters her head to look for some doctrinal formula as an explanation of her behaviour.
Just before we leave this segment, Jim, I wonder if we should look in the mirror and ask ourselves if there is any truth in the claim that complementarity has contributed to the mistreatment of women in the church. Is there even a little bit of truth in the claims made by egalitarians like Amy Bird or even Rachel Held Evans?
That is a sobering question. One of the problems with this topic is that we all bring our own life experience into the conversation. I've had the privilege of being surrounded by intelligent and substantial women for all of my life. My mother was a force of nature, bursting with intellectual curiosity. My sister Helen is fiercely intelligent. She's a formidable Greek scholar, so I often phone her up and ask her for help when I'm preparing a sermon. And my late wife was a much more spiritual and substantial human being than I will ever be. So when I enter into a conversation about gender distinctives, there are some assumptions that I make that other people do not make. It's really interesting, when I started to research this area, I discovered to my horror that what I call complementarianism is quite different from the views that egalitarians criticize. For want of a better term, there is an extreme form of complementarity that probably has contributed to the mistreatment of women.
What we might call the balanced complementarian position sees different roles being allocated in church life, and it also hints at really subtle distinctions in the way husbands and wives live together. But what you're calling extreme complementarianism goes much further, doesn't it?
Yes, I'm just going to set out 5 ways that complementarianism can become extreme and unbalanced. Amy Bird gives a bizarre example of the first way in her book. The extremists claim that all women should submit to all men. Now, that is something the Bible never says. But according to this view, all men should lead all women. So, for example, if the postman comes to the door and a woman answers, he needs to be thinking about how his leadership as a man is affirmed in their interaction. I assume that example was created before the days of Amazon delivery guys who hurled their parcels at my front door while doing a handbrake turn in the driveway. But she gives another ridiculous example. If a man gets lost and stops to ask a woman for directions, apparently the man has to think deeply about how to avoid his masculinity suffering in that moment. Now, that is just complete madness. There are 3 realms in the way we live, 3 orders. There's home life, church life, and civil life. And complementarity has nothing to say about civil life. So that's the first thing I would say about extreme forms of complementarity. The second point is that complementarity has nothing to do with physical intimacy. Some extremists have argued that during intercourse, the man is to give generously and the woman is to receive hospitably. Now, that sort of language just feels creepy to me. If you read the Song of Songs, you'll see that when it comes to the bedroom, you should be egalitarian. Now, while we're sitting in this embarrassing territory, Ollie, I think we need to say something about the so-called purity culture or the purity movement. Because it did a lot of damage to women. It was an exercise in legalism. But specifically, it taught a generation that men are testosterone-fueled animals with no self-control, and so it was every woman's duty to dress like a nun in case she caused a man to lust. Now, that is nonsense. Men are called to be mentally pure and self-controlled. They are to treat young women with absolute purity, like their younger sisters. And if there is to be a conversation about modest dressing, it should not involve men at all. That is a conversation between older and younger women. So that was point 2. My third point is that complementarity is not based on a power structure within the Godhead. Some theologians got a bit carried away in the 1990s and they started to talk about a doctrine called the eternal subordination of the Son. Now, we don't have time to go down that particular rabbit hole, but it leads us away from orthodoxy. It's an idea that personally I find a bit too speculative. We might want to unpack it later in a later episode. Fourthly, complementarity never sees the husband as the wife's redeemer. Yes, husbands are to love their wives as Christ loved the church, but that instruction is about sacrificial giving and generous serving. Both women and men are members of the royal priesthood, to use the language of the Apostle Peter. We are both co-heirs of the gift of life. So there is absolutely no asymmetry in the way men and women approach God. And the fifth and final thing I would say is that marriage is a good thing, but is not an ultimate thing. So a single person is not an incomplete human being. Some extreme complementarians developed such a strong view of marriage that they created an equation that said a half plus a half equals 1. The real equation of marriage is that 1 plus 1 equals 3. 2 whole and complete human beings create something that is greater than the sum of their parts. And that something greater doesn't necessarily refer to children. A childless couple can also build a marriage that is greater than the sum of its parts. And for those who never get married, remember that Christianity bestows a high value on singleness. So, those 5 points represent what I've called extreme complementarity. Now, I don't for a moment suggest that even those extreme views can lead to sexual abuse, but I do think they have damaged women in church and home life. So those of us who hold to balanced complementarity need to recognize that we agree with a lot of the criticisms thrown at the extremists by egalitarians.
Just to close out this conversation, Jim, let's think about the right way to debate the role of women in the church and the wrong way. What's the right way?
The right way is to have the arguments about how to interpret the scriptures. So we have to go into the weeds of how best to translate certain Greek words, how to unpack Paul's densely written arguments. We need to think really carefully about Scripture's delicate, nuanced concept called headship. and how that concept was coarsened and degraded into a power relationship by the fall of man. Now, as I said at the start of this conversation, Ollie, I'm not trying to persuade anyone to change their position on the role of women in the church. My concern is that the issue has been weaponized in a culture war that has imported critical theory into the church. So the wrong way to argue about complementarity is to join the chorus of the progressive left and start to regard male elderships and male Bible teachers as the oppressors in a system. To be completely blunt, I think this is how the evil one is going to bring down thousands of churches in the West. Once elderships are seen as inherently abusive, then churches are in serious trouble. You have to remember that Paul built churches in which thousands of intelligent, substantial women found refuge. They found in his churches a dignity, a sense of self-worth that they had never experienced before. So don't allow yourself to be manipulated by these neo-Marxist ideologies. Remember, it's those ideologies which are destroying the very concept of womanhood. So where does that leave us? Well, this society does not treat women well. And sometimes the church has also failed women. We started off thinking about how some wicked men within the church can transform a place God designed as a safe refuge into an abusive environment. Now, thank God, many churches do in fact offer a place of refuge from the values of this culture. So how ironic it would be if young Christian women allied themselves with ideologies like critical theory and end up being used to tear down the churches that God designed as a safe refuge for them.
Thanks, Jim, and thank you all for listening to this episode of The Equip Project. If you'd like to follow up on anything we've said, please do email us at theequipproject@gmail.com. We'll be back again next week with episode 3, but until then, have a great week.